In today's episode, you'll meet Michiel Brouns, a linseed paint expert who might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about paint. His interview was too good to cut short, so we didn't. We're spending the full episode with Michiel answering your questions, busting myths, and making linseed paint a little less mysterious. But first, I'm Stacy Grinsfelder, and you're listening to True Tales from Old Houses. Hello, everyone. I'm flying solo for the first few minutes of this episode, but Daniel will be joining me for the interview portion. If you listen to the last episode, you'll know that Daniel was about to become a godfather to his friend's baby. And, babies just come whenever they want to. And this one came 2 weeks early. So congrats to Daniel and his friend as well. Before we launch into today's episode, I do want to say a quick thank you to the Window Course, Sutherland Wells, Repaint Studios, and Old House Hub from My Old House Fix. We absolutely could not do this show without them. We are so grateful for the support. Now, we do have a full hour of linseed paint information, but I do have a couple things to tell you. The first is that there is still space available at the wood window workshops at Silver Lake that I'm teaching this summer. You may choose from one of 2 weekends, July 11th through the 13th or July 18th through 20th. You'll get 20 hours of instruction, including linseed paint application. That's new for this summer. You'll get a work apron and a cute little patch. I hope I did not ruin that surprise. Brad cooked that up for participants this summer. You'll also get 2 follow-up calls with me if you get stuck. And then there's social time built in. We're going to Letchworth State Park. We're having pizza. We're having drinks at the local brewery. Non-alcoholic options are always available. And I just want to remind everyone that Silver Lake Institute is a half day's drive, plus or minus, from places like Toronto and Hamilton in Canada, Pittsburgh, Erie, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, the Hudson Valley, and all of the surrounding metropolitan and rural areas. So I hope you can come. Check out blakehillhouse.com and you'll find all the information there that you need. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I had a couple of requests for the playlist. If you listen to the Taliesin West episodes with Fred Prozillo, we also included songs from Frank Lloyd Wright's favorite music. And I had some requests for that playlist. And it turns out that Nicole Richard, who is the archivist there at Taliesin West, already knew where to find it. It's on Spotify. So if you were interested in listening to more music from Taliesin West and Frank Lloyd Wright's time there, then I'll drop the link for you right in the show notes. That is really all I needed to tell you today. One other little tiny correction is that over the past episode or two, I believe I totally butchered Michiel's name. When you see it spelled and then you hear it said, you'll understand why I made the mistake. But I do want to really clarify today that it is Michiel Brouns. So let's get started. I am so excited to share Michiel's interview with you today. What we did is we took your questions straight from Instagram and we just put them in a little format. And that's where we focused our interview time with Michiel. So let's get to it.
Hello, I'm Michiel Brouns from Brouns & Co. And I'm the founder and CEO of the company I started about 11 years ago.
Welcome.
Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You and I met in Astoria, Oregon. We were both at the Window Preservation Alliance conference and we hung out. We had a good time. That's when I figured out, I thought, I definitely need you to be on the podcast to talk about linseed oil paint. However, I think we all butchered your name.
I'm not too pressured about it, but thanks for the opportunity. No, it's particularly tricky because I'm actually Dutch. So a lot of people think that I'm British, but I'm not. I do have British nationality now as well. So my name is, I would pronounce it as Michiel Brouns.
Nice to meet you, Michiel Brouns.
I want to start by talking about your company. So tell us a little bit about your company and how it started.
Oh, yeah. Well, my background is actually in historic building surveying and historic building preservation back in the Netherlands. Yeah, I was working out the other day that this is now 25 years ago, which is a bit scary that I'm getting to that point. I'll say something is 25 years ago, especially in the work, in the career sphere. So I worked for what turned out to be, which I didn't know at the time when I actually started working for the guy, but Hosker van Zabelhoff was a turned out to be one of the leading experts in historic building materials in the Netherlands. And in a period of about 3.5 years, I think it was, he pretty much taught me everything there was to know about lime washes, lime renders, linseed paint, historic glazing, glass. We discovered like historic roof trusses, the whole lot. Because actually, where I'm from, it's from near the city of Maastricht, which, for anybody interested in that kind of thing, historically had pretty much every kind of European superpower occupy it during the time. So it was occupied by the Spanish, by the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, the French. I think Napoleon came in. Anyway, they all left their traces with their particular building vernacular. So I got to work on this enormous variety of historic buildings, from complete stone structures, Tudor-style wattle and daub structures to everything. At the time, I had no idea that was such a privilege. I enjoyed it, but it was like later on where you go, oh, wow, I can pretty much tackle every kind of historic building in terms of, yes, surveying and making sure that we check if there are any issues. And if there are, what do we do about it? What kind of materials do we use? What methodology do we use? So I did a lot of conveyancing. And one of the problems that we already came up against in the Netherlands, even at that time, was we knew which historic building materials were correct to use, but so many just weren't available anymore. And so it was at that point, so I'm talking, 25 years ago, just about the reintroduction of lime renders and lime washes to the Dutch restoration market. People are still just specifying modern plastic film forming paint on wood and on metal. So we started to already kind of look into linseed paint as a product. And I first started another company called Histoglass. I came up with a glass system which gives a whole lot of modern insulating and not just insulation values, but we're talking acoustic and thermal performance, but also UV protection, a whole load of issues. So we did amazing buildings. We did, Old War Office in London. We did Queen's House, National Maritime Museum, loads of palaces. We did really top end kind of stuff.
So let me stop you for just a second. So that was glass you were doing? Is that what I understand?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. You've got my attention.
Yeah. So glass as in either a really thin double glazing system. Sorry, terminology, glazing. Glass, double glass.
We're with you.
We know that one, yeah.
All right, okay, fine. Because I got told off in a store for using the word glazing or glass, and I would use it differently. Anyway, so everyone would talk about the same thing. And this was so thin and with such a small sight line that you can install it in existing window frames.
Wow.
So you don't have to start butchering the historic fabric to put these units in. So you can essentially remove the existing single panes wherever necessary and put these systems in. So we came up with like 3 or 4 different systems. And
And are these IGUs? Is that what they are?
Yeah.
Insulated glass units. Okay.
That's the terminology. There we go. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So I was doing all these presentations to architects' practices and preservation professionals, and they basically just kept coming back and just like, well, okay, we understand why we need to use these IGUs, but if we're overhauling a window, what paint should we use? So I was like, well, obviously you need to use linseed paint. And I just expected to basically get like an affirmative nod, kind of like, oh yeah, okay, great. Yeah, we'll use that then. And instead I was just met with this kind of blank look. Well, what is that? I was like, wow, you don't. So even the professionals, preservation architects working at these really high end exclusive buildings, some of them hadn't even heard of linseed paint. I was like, okay, this is something I need to change. So that's why I then started Brouns & Co. Initially, it was always done with the idea, I'll do this alongside, because how many people are really going to be interested in this? Is this the commercial thing? And it just took off like nothing else, because especially with the professionals, they realize, because what I always explain to them is, if you are using lime renders and lime washes, use that logic. But then when you start to treat timber and metal, why would you wrap those surfaces in plastic? It doesn't make sense. You need to use something that does the opposite. And it took off so much, the interest in it, that I thought, well, and it wasn't around. So it's like, I need to start making it. That's in a nutshell, the story of the company.
Yeah.
Can I ask in a nutshell, how does one go from, oh, this is a hole in the market to, I have a company? I can't even fathom the steps.
Okay. Yes, I know that I'm wired slightly weirdly.
You're in good company.
But for me, this was like just registered. Literally, I thought, okay, we need to do this. And I registered the company. This is really interesting. I remember when I was doing that, because I was watching, I've always been into American sports as well. And I was watching the Super Bowl. And because with the time difference, that was during the night. So I had that on in the background, and I wrote the whole business plan and registered the company and did the whole thing just there and then. And by the time it was 6 a.m, the Super Bowl had finished, and I had my business plan and the company was registered, and that was it. That's kind of how it started.
And what was the halftime show that year?
Do you know what? This is how interested I am in the halftime show. I have no idea.
Oh my gosh. We're different.
It was interesting. No, I can't remember.
Is this a good time to say, go Bills?
They were definitely not in the final.
No.
No.
So we have a bunch of listener questions for you to answer about linseed oil paint. So I think a lot of the information that we would personally ask you, Daniel and I, is going to come up when I ask you those listener questions. But I do want to talk about I want to ask you one thing before we get started. And I would say, what are some of the most common, widely held misconceptions about linseed oil paint? Let's start there. Now, I know you're going to probably want to talk a really long time. So, that just sounded rude when I said that to you. But what I meant was...
You're right.
I'm so glad we know each other, Michiel. So don't get too far into it, because I'll be asking you questions that will also relate to that. So, yeah.
Okay. Try and keep it very short. That it's always goes moldy. You get mildew, mold growth on linseed paint. That's one of the most common ones that I hear. That it doesn't dry very easily, or it takes a really long time to dry, and that it has to contain lead in order to work.
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that.
I've never heard that last one.
No, that one hasn't reached America yet, but we'll see what we can do to we'll see what we can do to get that one going here. Yeah.
We put it in our drinking water.
Yeah.
Well, those are some things that we've heard too. And the last time we did a show on linseed oil paint, we talked to Natalie from Earth and Flax. And I remember doing that interview because at that time I was really interested in how the paint itself was made. And I feel like we spent a great deal of our time talking about that. How is it made? And so I don't really want to go into that again, because I'm just going to invite people to go back and listen to that episode. I believe it was episode 55, whichever one it is. The correct link and number will be in our show notes for this particular episode. So today I really want to focus on these misconceptions and the subsequent questions that have been really swirling around in the US since, the last few years. But 2021, I feel like we all started talking about linseed oil paint a lot, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge. So I separated the questions into some areas of interest. The first one being preparation, and then also application, performance, and then limitations. And I have a few miscellaneous questions. So I guess let's talk about preparation. And Daniel, would you like to ask the first question?
I definitely would. So Anna asks, but I also ask. These are all sort of thinly veiled, my own don't know anything. Anna asks, do I need to scrape my original 100-year-old siding down to the bare wood before applying linseed paint?
Not necessarily.
Really?
So this is a big misconception. So linseed paint needs to penetrate the substrate, right? So any coating that prevents that from happening, that's the one that needs to come off. So it tends to be the modern petrochemical finishes that have been put on in the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years. But I see a lot of houses where people just slapped on some new siding, maybe like 20, 30 years ago. They ripped that siding off. The original is still there, but that is actually the original linseed oil paint. Well, that doesn't need to be removed. That is a perfect substrate, and then paint straight over. Give it a good clean, give it a good wash, and you're ready to go. Yeah.
Fascinating.
We like hearing that.
Recognizing this may be different in different places. I have an 1865 house. I have been doing a ton of scraping and stripping and all of that. The bottom layer does seem to be very much like soaked in. Do you think that's a good indication that it's linseed, or is there a way for me to test whether it's linseed?
There is a way that you can test whether it's a modern petrochemical paint. So it's an easy way around. If you just wipe it with a little bit of denatured alcohol, methylated spirit, just wipe that on a cotton pad or cotton bud. If that comes off, if the color comes off on the cotton bud, it's a plastic. It's a petrochemical paint. That needs to be removed. So if you do that test and you wipe it, I am pretty sure that nothing will come off. well, then you don't need to remove it. It's fine. It's perfect substrate.
Okay.
And I want to just add a little clarification to that, because that's something that we run into in the United States, is that we had this, I'm sure you know this, Michiel, that we had this period of time with oil paints that were also still sort of lead petrochemical based. They almost look like nail polish or nail varnish, I believe, where you're from.
Well, yes.
If you rub it over that, shiny, it's usually really shiny. So if you rub it over that and you don't have the color, then to me, I don't think that's linseed paint. I think that's that old semi-modern mid-century oil paint here. So I don't know if you run into that.
Yeah.
But I think what you're talking about, Daniel, is something that does look more like it's almost absorbed into the wood, where there's no shine to it. There's no way you could peel it or chip it or anything. It's actually sort of part of the wood. So I just wanted to add that clarification in case people are using that trick with the denatured alcohol.
Yes, no, yeah, very good point. And well, this actually leads me into very briefly into another point that you've kind of explained a little bit, but it's one of the misconceptions is that, like I said, is that we still talk about lead paint. There is actually no such thing as lead paint. It's either historically linseed paint, where white or red lead was added as a pigment, or what you can see probably from the mid 1940s to around about late 1960s. You have a period where white lead was still added as a pigment to modern petrochemical alkyds, acrylics, latex paint. It's a very brief window. So just because something is a modern paint doesn't mean you have to exclude lead. Always test it for that, and the other way around.
Okay. Yeah. Really good point. So something you and I talked about, I remember in Astoria, was, let's say you have this house, this fits under preparation too. Let's say you have a house and you get most of the paint off. You're down to that old, probably linseed oil paint that could be penetrated, but maybe you have a patch here and there of sort of petrochemical stuff that you just can't get off. And it's really not worth the muscle to try to get it off. I believe, if I understand correctly, you said that was okay. You could still use linseed oil paint.
Absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Again, this is one of these things where there are a lot of misconceptions, and because obviously there's a whole industry now built on paint removal as well. So I from that point of view, I can see exactly where they're coming from. But purely from applying linseed paint sticks to pretty much any substrate. It overpaints onto modern plastic paints absolutely fine. But the main reason to remove those film forming paints is because you want the full wicking properties of linseed paint to happen. And with wicking, and again, I hear this and I heard this used kind of arbitrarily in a story as well. Wicking is essentially just the capacity of the wood to shed excess moisture that it contains through diffusion, right? So linseed paint works like Gore-Tex. That's the closest analogy I can always give. So you wear your Gore-Tex jacket when you go running in the rain. Raindrops are too big to penetrate the fabric, but any kind of sweat you develop underneath, the droplet size is so small, it will wick out through the surface, through diffusion. So what you want to have enough of the surface area in the wood for the moisture in that wood, excess moisture, to be able to wick out to the surface. So if you have some patches here or there where it can't happen, it's irrelevant because the wood grain will transport that moisture to the point where it basically gets around that patch and then wick out to the surface. So again, don't overthink it. That's probably going to be the summary of this whole interview, is just don't overthink it, get on with it, make a start. Don't be daunted by the whole project of kind of scraping everything. It's a percentage game.
So just to make sure I understand, it will adhere and dry and do paint stuff over an not ideal substrate, but you just won't get all of the benefits of the linseed product.
Yeah, correct. You can think of it in the other way around. So invert that. So if you have certain knots that come up that you want to apply knotting agent, so that you prevent any of the resins coming out. So I mean, I always recommend a shellac knotting primer, but you can use basically whatever is in the market. But you overpaint that with linseed paint as well. Essentially, you're creating these patches where the paint is not going to penetrate. So if we're doing it there, we can't then say at the same time, oh, but you have to scrape every micrometer of the old paint off. No, it's not necessary.
Okay. So I also want to add something too, just to make sure that our listeners are hearing this too. Like if let's say we have a shed and it's fully enclosed in or encased in a modern petrochemical paint, doesn't really need to be repainted, but we want to change the color. Linseed we probably wouldn't choose that because if you put linseed over all of that plastic, you're not going to get the properties that linseed paint offers. I mean, it's great, but it's not what we're talking about.
No, correct. So you're not doing it then for the benefit of the wood or the metal. You're then purely doing it for the benefit of not using plastics.
Right, right. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to make sure and bring that up because
absolutely
we're attacking this from all angles just to make sure everybody understands, including me.
So your last step of prep is usually just a nice wipe down. What would you recommend for that? Like I would usually use mineral spirits, I guess, but that's a petrochemical. Does it matter?
That will completely evaporate. So that's kind of fine. I don't think that's going to be too much harm, but actually I would just give it a wipe with a bit of a damp cloth.
Okay.
I think that's all just to remove any kind of dust that might still be on there from the scraping. Actually, one thing that to add, a lot of questions that we get where people have, say, like, maybe 25 windows in the house. That is almost like more daunting than doing siding, because the siding, you can just get on with it and all the finer detailing in a window is a lot of people don't want to, or don't have the budget maybe to strip it all. And I always recommend focus on that bottom third, right? Focus on the lower sill and the horizontal elements where water can sit. And obviously gravity makes sure that water kind of runs down into the bottom area. That's why I've yet to see major wood rot in the top sash of a window because water just doesn't get trapped there.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of people have questions about windows, especially because a lot of people who follow me know that I do window restoration education.
Exactly.
So yeah, lots and lots of questions about windows for sure. Okay, so let's move on to application. Amy said, I used linseed oil paint on a floor and the cure time was so long that it got stained before it cured. Do you have any tips?
Okay. Now, there's a lot to unwrap here. First of all, use the right tools. It doesn't matter what kind of product you use. It can be the most amazing product in the world. If you use the wrong tools, you're not going to get the benefits, right? So one of the things that I always recommend people do is use natural bristle brushes. Do not go for synthetic. Do not go for hybrid. Because the problem is the individual strands of hair on a brush, on a synthetic brush or a man-made thread, they're too smooth. They're perfect for water-based products. But because the surface tension of a water droplet is much higher, that will cling to that bristle absolutely fine. But if you try to do it with linseed oil, which has a much lower surface tension, so in essence it has a much smaller droplet size, the brush just doesn't work. You start to brush it out and you just can't really get rid of it. And you get like a bit of a streaky finish. You start to drag it. It just doesn't feel right. Whereas if you go to a natural bristle brush, first of all, they tend to be a lot stiffer. So you can really push the paint into the surface. And this is a bit that people need to kind of remember. You don't want to lay it on the surface in a film. This is not designed to be a film forming product. Almost think of it more as if you were applying a stain. Now, eventually when you build up the coat, you will get a bit of a coating on the surface, but that's not the aim. That's not what you're going for. And always use an application brush and a good quality finishing brush. And I see hardly anybody use this in the industry. People use an application brush and go like, great.
Okay. So what's the difference? Tell us the difference.
Right. Difference is an application brush. So if we go back to the natural bristle, they're made from hog's hair, which is really quite a stiff bristle. And again, that's great for application, right? Because you want to push that paint and the oil into the wood or into the metal, but it's quite coarse. So you don't get a really nice brush mark. And also it means if you were to look at like a cross section of the painted substrate, you could see really quite high peaks and valleys. That's the brush marks. So what you really want to do is take a finishing brush or laying off brush, as we call them in the UK, flattening brush, you can call them. And it's probably flattening brush is probably the best term because what you do is you take out those peaks, you flatten them, and therefore you take out away the brush marks and also the less material you have on your surface, the better it dries. Linseed paint that's applied too thick will struggle to dry. That's the key thing. Applied in thin coats.
Okay, so you're taking your application brush and you're kind of working the linseed oil paint into the substrate, and then you follow it in that same coat with a finish brush to smooth it all out. And
yeah, but leave it for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Interesting.
So you put the application coat on. This has quite a long open time.
Sure.
Right? And actually what will happen is once you've applied it, it will I always I mean, I told you I am a little bit weird, but I do talk to the paint and I go like, hey, you go and do your thing now. I'll go and have a cup of tea and then I'll come back after like 30 minutes. And then with a flattening brush, you don't actually use that brush to dunk into your can and to paint with. This is just the brush that we only use to very lightly drag over the surface, like just feather light. And you can see the sheen level go up because it becomes smoother and flatter. And also you kind of remove any of the excess product that you have.
Okay. Interesting.
That is so helpful.
Isn't
Thank
it? Yeah.
Yeah, because this is, we ran into that with the windows at Silver Lake where Brad used linseed paint, but it was taking really long time to dry. I'm positive he was using the wrong brushes. So yeah, this is
makes a lot
so
of
helpful.
sense.
Thank
you.
It becomes really difficult to put a really thin coat on with a modern brush. Almost impossible.
Okay. So when I was in Astoria, there was another person there and she was showing people how to use linseed oil paint. And she had this little, looked like a card or a little, it was either metal or plastic or something where she was measuring the thickness, I think. Can you describe that or explain that, or is that necessary? Or how is that helpful? We're not trying to disparage her. I was just trying to understand what I was seeing.
Exactly. No. This is why I do these kind of interviews as well and everything, or podcasts and stuff, because I want to educate. So these gauges, they basically help you gauge the film thickness. They are very, very useful for modern petrichor paints. They're completely pointless, really, when you use a linseed paint on an absorbing substrate using a natural bristle traditional brush. That paint will go on so thin, it will barely even, I don't know if you remember, but it didn't even show up on the gauge. There was actually a discussion about how thick should it be, as thin as possible, which is, I'm not evading the answer. It's kind of, you need to think about the paint as being part of the substrate that you're painting. The paint is a building product. It's not just a pretty color. That's the key thing, right? So I don't even really care about the color most of the time. Yeah, sure, we can make it and make it look nice, but it's a sacrificial coat to protect the wood. So it becomes part of it. So by using the right brushes and really brushing it out, you will automatically put it on thin enough, and you don't need these gauges.
Okay. I would go further, I guess, to explain to listeners out there who are still like trying to understand how linseed is different. Like, consider stain. If you're staining something and you wipe stain on, the directions always say wipe off the excess. If you don't wipe off the excess, you're going to see the stain that's soaked into your wood, and then you're going to see blobs of sticky color, and that's going to stay sticky for a really long time. And so I see this application of linseed and then waiting, just like we would wait for stain, and then coming back with your finish or flattening brush, as you called it, to make sure everything's, I would see those as very similar processes. So I just want to mention that.
That is a much more a closer analogy to using linseed paint than a modern paint application is.
Great. Yeah, that was super helpful.
So helpful. Thank you.
True Tales from Old Houses is supported by The Window Course. The Window Course was created by Scott Seidler of the Craftsman blog, and it's a step-by-step, do-it-yourself program that will teach everything you, the homeowner, need to know to successfully restore your wood windows. It's self-paced, so you can go as fast or as slow as you need, and there are also several price points to fit your needs and budget.
Now's the perfect time to study up on how to restore the windows at your house, and the Window Course has all of the information you need all in one place.
Scott has a special deal for his students. If you sign up for the Lifetime Access Package or the Training Package, you'll get a free infrared paint remover, and that's a $100 value.
The Window Course is also offered with a money-back guarantee, and Scott is offering the True Tales from Old Houses community a special discount. For 10% off, visit thewindowcourse.com and use the code TRUETALES.
True Tales from Old Houses is also supported by Sutherland Wells. All of Sutherland Wells products are handcrafted in Providence, Rhode Island, with the highest quality, sustainably grown tung oil. Tung oil, native to China, has been used for centuries as a durable finish for wood, metal, and stone.
Now, unlike polyurethane, tung oil finish actually penetrates the surface of the wood, so it flexes and contracts as conditions change. That makes it the perfect pre-finish or protectant for everything from fine furniture to window sash and sills. I recently used the exterior polymerized tung oil in medium luster for my brand new porch floor. It is Douglas fir, and it is absolutely gorgeous. I did 3 coats, and it's smooth as velvet and completely sealed for our harsh New York winters. I also recommended the wiping varnish to a friend who used it on their ButcherBot kitchen countertops and absolutely loved it as well.
Sutherland Wells has an entire product line for whatever you're working on. Siding, hardwood floors, furniture restoration, cutting boards, you name it.
To learn more about the complete product line, visit Sutherland Wells, that's WELLES, sutherlandwells.com. And to save 10% on your first order, use the coupon code TrueTales.
All right, so let's move into performance. Daniel, you're on.
Emmy asks, how often does exterior linseed paint need to be touched up or recoated?
Ooh, good question. To understand this is not a completely straightforward answer because this isn't a lab developed product. So this was a paint that was used for centuries by farmers, right? Now, from that point of view, it's easy and it's quick. The only time you need to really start doing it when it goes so matte that you're only left with the pigment on the surface. And when you rub it, you start wiping off the pigment on your hand. Actually, technically, it still works. You don't want to let that get to a point where you have no binder at all anymore on the paint. But say on a north-facing facade, so certainly in the northern hemisphere, maybe 12 to 15 years. However, on a south-facing facade, with a lot of direct sunlight, where the oil on the surface gets broken down much more quickly, and you're left with a more matte finish, that's where you see that kind of maintenance cycle come down. So if you actually manage to stay on top of giving it a wipe with a little bit of linseed oil, and for that use boiled oil. Please don't use raw oil, because raw oil would encourage kind of mold growth. Because there's nothing, I mean, it doesn't matter how much you filter it and how purified it is. Stuff wants to eat it, wants to live in it. So the boiled oil reduces that risk. So all you're doing is nourishing that surface again. It's like basically like getting a really lovely old leather bag, but it's kind of dried out and you just put a bit of nourishment on it and it comes to life again. That's essentially what you do with paint. So you don't need to strip, paint, scrape, all of that. That was a one-off. Once you've set up the whole system, all you need to do when it goes matte is wipe it with a little bit of boiled linseed oil. And usually on a south-facing elevation, I would expect that to be around, well, maybe if you're in Arizona, something like maybe 3 years, 2-3 years. But if you're in, much further north, you'd be looking at maybe 5 to 7 years.
Okay.
And if you stay on top of that, you don't have to repaint.
Oh, ever?
This is really important for ever. Yeah.
Oh.
You only need to repaint if you let that go to a point where you've left it too long and there's no binder at all anymore. But even then, a quick wash, you just basically just give it a good wash with a bit of a scrubber. And when it's dry, then just give it one coat of paint. And that's your maintenance.
Would you use linseed oil soap to do the wash? Or is there some other kind of soap that you would recommend?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great.
But basically any detergent will do. Yeah, don't go too harsh. But any just regular soapy detergent should probably do. Just make sure you rinse it well enough. You don't want to be left with any soapy residue because then you start put the oil on and the oil starts to break down.
Right. What if people do find mildew or mold? And I'm not blaming the paint. I just flat out, people have trees or shrubs or whatever next to their house. Yeah, it just happens. What kind of cleaner should they use before they add more linseed oil paint or linseed oil?
This is a great question because, again, it's one of those kind of, it's a bit of a debunking situation going on here because people think they have to use like chlorine or something. Absolutely not. Always use white vinegar. That's the only thing that actually breaks down mildew. Anything else just masks it. It doesn't actually break it down.
Interesting.
And then you wash it with that, rinse it really well, and then give it fresh coat of paint.
Okay. Would you use a diluted white vinegar solution or are you talking about straight up? What are we talking?
I tend to go quite harsh with this. I try to get the strongest white vinegar that I can find and do that neat.
Okay. Interesting. Wow.
And just for our American listeners, usually you can find very strong vinegars online, like 75%, I think is.
And that's the ones that you want.
Yeah. But it will like burn your skin. It will kind of burn your eyes, your nose. Like, be careful with it.
Good example of that. Something because it's natural isn't necessarily healthy.
Right.
Just use precaution when you use it. Yeah.
Right. Exterior. Okay. Well, I think you really answered this question really well because the only follow-up I had was that do you ever have to strip off linseed paint and start over? And the answer is no.
No, because it doesn't crack or flake or peel. So as long as you nourish that, whatever the UV light breaks down, which is the oil, if you put that back, that's it.
Right. And I would guess if you want to change colors, you just do a primer, and by the time you add, or the linseed oil primer paint combo, like the diluted
You
pigment.
don't even have to.
No, you just put the new
No,
color
you don't
over.
even have to. It just put a new color on, and
All
it
right.
will probably cover in 2 coats. The tricky thing there is not to, because so per can of paint, between 65 and 72% of that is solid pigment content, right? That's powder, essentially, dispersed in the oil. So the temptation is, when you start paying for it, is to cover everything in 1 coat, because it covers so well. The coverage is super strong. Don't be tempted, because then you will put it on too thick and then it doesn't dry, and then you can't put the subsequent coats on, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Okay. Totally makes sense.
Can I ask, just for clarity, what would the primer be for? That's Stacy.
The primer tends to be for, well, we've got 2 different primers, but we'll stick to the wood for now. For wood, what you want to do is, assuming we're working on bare wood, right? So nothing to interfere with the penetration of the oil and the paint into the wood. So what you want to do is to get that product into the wood as deeply as possible. That's what gives you the most durability. So what we recommend is to thin the paint with, well, have a ratio of about 50% paint, about a third or 5%, 35% of raw linseed oil, and then about 15%, or as I call it, just a good glug of balsam natural gum turpentine. You mix that really well, because what the raw linseed oil does, because the surface tension of the raw oil is lower than the boiled oil. All paint should be made from boiled oil, not from raw oil, right? So what you're doing, you add the raw oil in to make it essentially make that droplet size smaller than the paint has as a droplet size. Therefore, it penetrates deeper. But because it can't get UV light when it's in there, so how's it going to dry? It can't really. So that's why you add the balsam or the gum turpentine. And that's the only thing it does. It basically becomes your accelerant, your drying. It is really to get those pigments into the wood as deeply as possible. And this is, again, linked to quite a few. I see so much misinformation about this out there as well, where people recommend that you have to heat the oil, really completely soak and saturate the wood with just oil. Please don't. The protection against UV light comes from pigments, not from the oil. I'd love to say that it's the oil, but it's not. It's the pigments that give you the protection, right? You want pigments to straight away go into as deeply into the wood as possible to give you that durability. So what happens if you just saturate the wood first with just oil? Well, where's the pigment going to go once you actually start painting it? You're completely relying on that first coat of paint to just bond to the very surface to that oil. I've seen that delaminate. And you're like, well, so we're trying to get people to make, in some cases, quite a big mental shift from a petrochemical paint to a linseed paint, and then it gets applied in the wrong way, and there's an issue, and people get like, see, linseed paint didn't work. No, it's the application, and it's understanding the full mechanics of this. Because that's the other thing, is when people say, oh, you should heat the oil to make it penetrate even deeper. Well, that doesn't work at all, because yes, it does penetrate deeper, absolutely. But then when that cools off, it starts to set hard and expand in volume, right? It's the same as like, you put a beer bottle in your freezer. When the temperature drops of the liquid, the volume expands. So the bottle just breaks.
Right.
It's a horrible cleaning up job.
Yeah.
If you do that essentially with oil into wood, when it then starts to cool off, if you heat that up, that temperature starts to come down to, say, like room temperature again. It starts to expand in volume and starts to warp and crack the timber from inside.
Oh,
and I've seen this at historic buildings here in the UK. And the whole gate needed to be completely remade.
Just from poor application.
Unnecessary.
Oh, yikes.
Unnecessary.
I want to add something about the, I think you said gum spirits or turpentine. The modern version of that is not what you're talking about, right? Like if we go to the store and we buy turpentine, that is not the same thing. So can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, the modern version has essentially a different chemical fingerprint. And what that does, it will start to break down the oil. It will start to break down your paint as soon as you start to adding it. And so you reduce the lifespan. It's complete. You might as well not add anything if you do that.
Okay.
Is that true of the boiled linseed oil that we can readily access at our big box stores?
Yeah, that should not be allowed to be called boiled linseed oil. There's nothing boiled about it. It's never seen any heat. It's just been washed with chemicals to try and get that polymerization happening. All you're trying to do is when you boil it, you change the carbon links and essentially giving it more capacity to start bonding with oxygen. And that's your drying, right? So there are lots of different ways that you can achieve that same result. But trust me, the modern ones and the cheap ones, they're just washed with chemicals because it's so much easier to do than actually heating it.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Okay. Wow.
Wow.
There's a lot to unpack here because now I'm going down the aisles of my big box store in my head thinking there's nothing there that we could use for this. So we would have to start. Go ahead, Daniel. What were you going to say?
I'm so sorry to circle back on this, but you did mention delaminating. So is it the case that essentially linseed paint should never peel when it's applied over a bare surface, but it might peel if it's applied over a modern petrochemical paint? Is that sort of right?
Well, yes. But actually what's really happening is that the modern petrochemical paint starts to peel, and therefore the linseed paint starts to peel, right? The linseed paint can only work as well as the substrate that you're going to put it on. So this is why prep is essential. Yeah, good prep is essential.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
True Tales from Old Houses is supported by Repaint Studios. Okay, confession time, Daniel. In the past, how did you store your paint tray when you were mid-project?
The worst way, Stacy, I would use those cheap plastic liners and then I would store them in the trash.
Well, you won't get any judgment from me because I used a garbage bag and that was a sticky mess. But now I use the repaint tray.
I'm also a recent convert, so let's spread the word.
Billy, the inventor, knew that this was a problem for so many, so she created the solution. And now her woman-owned business is disrupting the paint industry. The repaint tray solves that mid-project paint storage problem. It has a reusable silicone liner, an airtight lid, and it keeps your paint fresh for weeks.
Weeks, like weeks and weeks.
It's like Tupperware, but for your paint tray.
Exactly. And the tray itself is also a really heavy-duty metal, so it doesn't slide around, wobble, or bend. Plus, when you're done painting, you can just let that paint dry right in that silicone liner, and then you get to peel it out, which is exactly as fun as it sounds.
The tray, silicone liner, and lid are built to last, which is better for you and the planet. It's the last paint tray you'll ever need, so save those garbage bags for the trash can.
Snag one for yourself at repaintstudios.com. And to save 10% off your order, use the coupon code TrueTales10. That's TrueTales10.
True Tales from Old Houses is also supported by Old House Hub, brought to you by My Old House Fix. Have you ever spent hours scrolling Facebook groups, Reddit threads, obscure websites, random YouTube videos, trying to find answers for your old house project?
Oh, Stacy, of course I have. And half the time I end up on like a deep dive where I come out 3 hours later, I know everything about Victorian paint colors and no idea how to fix my house.
That's why we are so excited to tell everyone about Old House Hub from My Old House Fix.
Yes, we are. It's like your headquarters for all things old house. It's an exclusive online community where you can gather resources, browse archives by topic, connect with fellow enthusiasts, and get expert advice. It's a place to share your passion without getting lost in endless social media feeds.
And no creepy AI algorithm suggesting totally unrelated content. It's just good, meaningful conversations with people who get it. No more scrolling, no more headaches, just connection and answers.
It's the beauty of old school internet for old house lovers. And the best part is right now, True Tales from Old Houses listeners can get a 1-year membership to the Old House Hub for free with the coupon code TrueTales.
That great deal is only available during this season of the podcast. When season 12 ends, the deal ends.
So don't wait. Visit oldhousehub.com to join the Old House Hub community for free and finally have a go-to place for your old house questions, projects, and inspiration.
We're all going to take a deep breath now. Move on to...
I didn't talk too much.
No, that is not the reason. I'm actually really thrilled. This is incredibly informative. It's useful. It's helpful. If I didn't want to listen to you talk, I would gently and politely steer you in another direction.
It's like, right, yeah, your hour is up.
Yeah, no, this is great. Well, maybe
No.
we'll have a two-parter. We're just going to finish all these questions, and it is what it is, because we've needed to have this conversation for a very long time. And more information is great, but what happens, as you know, is that the information gets a little distorted and twisted. It's like a really bad game of telephone. And then you add that to social media and memes and reels and whatnot.
And everybody being so sure about what they know and communicating it in a way as if it's an expert thing. And you go, like, well, you've never worked with linseed paint. How do you know about this?
Yeah.
I see this all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been at fault for sharing information, not in a grand way on social media, but certainly not knowing what I didn't know and maybe contributing to a conversation I had no business contributing to. So yeah, I appreciate this a lot. All right, let's move on to some limitations, because we did have questions about limitations. I think this is an important subject because, anyway, it's just an important subject. So yeah, let's start with limitations. Go ahead, Daniel.
So I have a situation where I've been working on this area of my house. Some stuff is totally stripped down to bare wood, and some stuff, the paint is pretty well adhered. So in my brain, my idea was maybe paint linseed on the stuff that is bare and use a modern latex on the stuff that is just layers and layers of well-adhered paint. I guess question one, will the linseed yellow a little bit over time? In other words, if I paint those two things next to each other today, will they look the same in 2 years?
Yes, it won't yellow if it gets exposed to UV light. Again, one of these misconceptions. The oil only yellows in a really dark spot. If it doesn't get UV light, the oil can yellow. This is why only really the whites yellow. Usually other colors, you can't even see that it's doing it. But it's also reversible. I've seen this in like if you have like my grandmother's house, like in actually I was quite young, 1903 or something. And in her kind of wardrobe, you open it and had this kind of yellowy butter kind of color on it. Well, you just kept those doors open for like a week and it started to go white again.
Oh.
It reverses.
Wow.
I had no idea.
No, same.
Shine some UV light on it and then, it's,
Yeah. But also what I took away from our earlier conversation, Daniel, is that you can go ahead and do linseed over this modern paint. You're not going to get the properties of it soaking in, but that eliminates the idea of two colors or trying to match two colors exactly. So I don't know. Just thought.
Yeah, and it will look exactly the same when you're finished, right? Whether you've painted on two different surfaces. And this is a really interesting one, for the listeners as well, is don't look for a nice finish after the first and the second coat. It will look patchy. It will look blotchy. It's supposed to. If you have a really nice, even finish on your first coat, you've put it on way too thick. Because what you're relying on is, and we're talking about bare wood here now, or stripped back, where certain parts absorb more oil. So you're left, that goes matte much more quickly. And then other areas where the oil stays more on the surface. So you have a higher sheen level. That's exactly what you want to see. So you want to even that out as you put more coats on. On the third coat, third coat, or say the second top coat, that's where you even it out. Don't even look at it from an aesthetic point of view after two coats. Don't get nervous.
Yeah.
Trust the process.
Yeah. Good point. And I guess this would be a great time. This is not necessarily with limitations, but people are saying, oh my gosh, 3 coats of paint. That's ridiculous. That's got to cost a small fortune. So tell us a little bit about the cost. That would be helpful.
Yeah, again, that's one of those misconceptions. And I understand why, because people see the price of one can and you go like, oh, that's expensive. Yes, but it covers at least 2 to 2.5 times as much as a conventional paint. By the time you're actually finished, per square foot, it shouldn't have cost you more than an equivalent modern paint from whatever hardware store. If it has cost you more, you have used too much paint. Let me just put it out that way. So, yeah.
This is a miscellaneous question, but it's a good place to put it. What is the shelf life of this product? So if I buy it and I use it and then I put it down in my basement for maintenance, but I don't need it for 5 to 7 years, am I still good?
It keeps indefinitely. Yeah. It doesn't go off. Because there's nothing in that paint that can actually go off. It's just literally powder pigments with boil-linseed oil. So I've seen cans of paint that are 56 years old. Yes, it does form a skin on top. and you get a bit of that crusty inside of the can. But if you actually stir that and put it through like a good sieve or through like some pantyhose, stockings, that's perfect. And then you just strain it. And then whatever comes out, it might be a little bit thick because it can thicken over time. I'll just add a little bit more boiled linseed oil to it to just regenerate. And you're good to go.
Right. Okay. The next question from Sierra. She says, can you use linseed paint on non-linseed putty glaze? So glazing putty. I think I know where she's coming from. So she's thinking probably of more like Sarco, which you may be familiar with because it makes the rounds here of the window preservation groups in the United States, which I know you've been a part of. Or DAP. DAP is the one that we usually strongly advise not to use because it's hard to work with and it does not work very well, even when it's done. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it adheres to anything. As long as that is fully cured and there's no chemical reaction going on, linseed paint will stick to it. It's fine.
But it is the case where you couldn't. One of the nice things when you use a straight up linseed putty like Dana Lim or some other brand like that is that you can just do the linseed oil paint right on the putty and then it all cures and it goes through the process together.
Yeah, this is what I always recommend people. Yeah, just paint as soon as you can.
Okay.
But it needs to be a genuine linseed putty.
Right.
Not with any kind of latex or acrylic additives.
So what I am hearing is that will absolutely not work over something like Sarco or DAP. You need to go through that general curing process as required by the manufacturer, 3 to 5 days or up to 2 weeks or something, depending on the product you're using. And then, yes, you can still use linseed oil paint because it'll work, but it's not the same as using it directly on linseed oil putty. So I'm like really measuring my words, just trying to make sure that we're saying it. I'm asking you, I'm getting the answer, I'm repeating it. It's active listening.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Next question's for you.
You summarized them correctly. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Again, I have run into, this is an active question of mine. Lustig asks, can I cover wood rot epoxy with linseed paint? So I think they're talking probably about Abitron or Next Gen Systems. Those are both pretty popular here as kind of gold standard putties.
Yeah, it's basically an extension of the previous question. Linseed, and I'll keep repeating this, but linseed paint will adhere to pretty much anything. So that's fine. We've seen loads of examples of overpainted epoxies. I'm just against epoxies, but that's a whole different discussion. I don't think there's any place for it in any kind of preservation because you trap moisture.
And it's not permeable. So you're if you have something that's, 90% epoxy that you put back together and you use linseed oil paint, you're probably not going to get the benefit of the linseed oil paint that you were hoping to get.
Correct.
Great. And Kelsey has the final question in this. And she said, I'm really on board with it, but I feel like everybody talks about it as this magic paint that's the best for everything. And she questions that. So she wants to know, what are the realistic limits, if any?
I love that there's pushback because we can actually frame it properly and critical thinking is everything. This is why I ended up doing what I did. So it is not the answer for everything. So there are definitely limitations. So it's definitely not if we're looking at painting stone or brick or renders or plasters, stick to the family that relates to that particular surface. So if you have a lime plaster, use a lime wash. If you have like a really dense, non-porous stone, use a silicate paint. Linseed paint works exceptionally well on wood and on metal. That's what it's proven for like 2,000 years. We can see these buildings that are still there because of the materials that we used. But yeah, it's not like we're not going to sit here and say like we need to cover everything in linseed paint. That's like the magic. No, it's for the right purpose and the right situation and the right application. That's exactly what it's perfect for.
Is it true that I'm also kind of hearing, though, that there is essentially no place for petrochemical modern paints in our homes?
I'm struggling to find one.
Okay, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I try to do that in the most political answer. There is
don't care.
Even if you don't, so it's an interesting discussion. So we can have a discussion about whether you believe that an alkyd is not going to trap moisture or contrary to all the evidence, you might still take that point. Great. Why would you still refine fossil fuels to make a paint that has such an enormous embodied energy, which is bad for everything? I mean, there's plastics in this is the latest part of the presentation that I do actually incorporates a lot of the unfortunately, something I feel like I have to address in these kind of presentations is that modern paints do all contain plastics, right? So whatever brand you can come up with now, it can be a good thought experiment. Picture a can of paint, about a third or 37% of that is liquid plastic, as polymers. That's in there. There's no avoiding this. So this finds its way into our waterways through all kinds of macro leakage, micro leakage. There have been studies about this. And I can send you links, say, if you want to do this kind of research. The latest is actually that the University of New Mexico have now found microplastics in our brains, actually to the tune of a disposable spoon. It's a huge amount. You know, one of these spoons that you get in a coffee shop. Yeah.
And I think I read it's something like 25% more than the same study 10 years ago or something.
Oh, wow.
Like it's becoming much, much worse very quickly.
And what people realize is that, and because plastic is usually categorized as like, straws or like, beer can wrappers or this kind of thing, right? But actually 58% of all microplastics in the oceans is caused by paint. And we're not talking industrial paint. We're not talking about the painted size of an oil tanker or something. No, we're talking about consumers washing their brushes, their tools, that all this washes down the drain. So sure, let's have a discussion about whether a paint is durable or not. But if we're actually serious about looking after our own health and the health of our kids and our environment, I struggle to find a reason why you would use a plastic petrochemical paint. But don't use linseed paint for everything. Use a lime wash, use your casein paint, use your silicate paint. Just understand what surface that you're painting, what performance you're looking for, and then select your paint accordingly.
Wow.
And I liked what you said about looking at the material that you're painting and picking something that is complementary to that material, like lime for stone.
Yeah, compatible products.
None of this is particularly difficult, but we've moved so far away from just common sense that we now just, we've been kind of brainwashed into going like, well, we need to put as many coats of paint on to prevent water getting in. First of all, you're not going to prevent water from getting in. It will always find a way in. What is the damage it's going to do once it's set there? Whether that's in stone or a wood or whatever it is.
Yeah. So, Michiel, you and I had this conversation in Astoria, and I remember it distinctly about how here in the United States, we're really making headway convincing people to replace like with like. So when it comes to masonry, for instance, we know that lime mortar is probably best on brick and stone, in a certain time period. And I think we're making some real headway with that. I see that on social media, and I see that it just in the conversations that I have with people about how they're repointing their brick or their stone. And we have made that leap. We've made that mental leap between, using just regular Portland cement is not the proper substance for us to use for repointing. But somehow we cannot make that leap between modern petrochemical paints and linseed oil paint. It's basically, we're having the same conversation. It is the same thing.
It's the same conversation. The only thing that's different about it is the money behind it. It's the lobby. Without getting into politics, we can, and I'm not tying this to one country. I saw this in the Netherlands when I did it there. I've seen this in the UK. I see this in the US. People don't realize that modern plastic paints are essentially an invention from the chemical industry. It is just a byproduct, right? The reason why it was invented to begin with, or why it found its way into the market on a mass market level, is right after the Second World War. They were left with all this kind of waste product from a war industry. And the biggest waste product of a war industry is once you've actually fueled your vehicles, you've made your ammunition, you're left with these polymers, which has sat there in these vast quantities all across the planet, mainly in ports. So people go like, okay, what can we do with this? So all of a sudden you see companies like Tupperware coming into the market. So everything turns plastic. So Tupperware for our kind of containers, Formica, plastic furniture, paint turns plastic. And you can see why people, especially if you've lived through 2 world wars, you want to look forward. It's all about the future. You don't want to have basically anything that's old or has an association with that. You go like, just enough of that already. We can do better than this. So people basically reinvented these building materials that were so much quicker. They set quicker. Portland cement becomes a massive product. Glass as a structural building element, which is a completely new concept as well. And paint turns plastic overnight. Not just linseed paint, lime wash completely disappears as well. So that actually makes a bit of resurgence in kind of, certainly in the Netherlands, it was kind of mid to late 90s, but only very specific conservation areas and preservation efforts. But then when I moved to the UK, we were about 10 years behind on continental Europe. And I can see the same thing happening now in the US, where the discussion is about maybe 5, 6, 7 years behind on the UK. But the big advantage of the US is I think you guys are quicker with accepting something that is presented as with the right facts and the right historic pedigree. And so, like, actually, do you know what? This works. Why haven't we been doing this wrong? There's less resistance. But it is about educating people about why did we have wood rot to begin with? Why do we have this?
Right.
And of all the, like, I've done thousands of surveys of historic buildings.
All right.
Wood rot, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Wood rot, as we know it, didn't exist. I know the answer. I know the rest of that sentence.
Good.
Okay. Well, this has been helpful. And I hope that this show will help distribute this information that you have, this really useful information. So we have just a few more questions. They're miscellaneous. They didn't fall anywhere. If we can do this as sort of the lightning round, because we're really out of time, but I still want to talk to you. So the first question is from Maddie, and she says, is there a risk of spontaneous combustion?
Of the rags drenched in oil? Yes. Okay. Not of the paint or a rag that is spread out.
Okay, great. And spontaneous combustion, I have to add to that, happens when liquids dry. So if you have dry paint on your siding, your house is not going to burst into flames. So
exactly. Or the paint in a can, that's not going to happen. That's completely harmless. Yeah.
Okay, great. Anna or Anna says, can she get color swatches? Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do color swatches. Yeah. We now have obviously our warehouse set up in New Hampshire, so we can service all of the US pretty quickly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Next one.
Windows of the Past asks, what is the best way to store leftover linseed oil paint?
A quick tip. Ideally you want as little oxygen on between the lid and the paint. If you can't decant it into something, just put some, we're going to get a translation thing here. You're going to help me out with this. We call it cling film. I think it's saran wrap or something. Is that what you call it? Yeah, right, there you go. Okay. So just put that on top of the paint and then tuck it up against the inside of the wall, because then the paint can't get any oxygen and therefore doesn't dry. So it's a lot easier next time. You just peel up. See, I'm not completely against plastics. In this case, it helps.
It helps, yeah. And I should say, I gave Saran too much credit. That's a brand. So a lot of us will call it.
Oh, is it? Yeah. I didn't know that.
Cellophane.
Or plastic wrap or whatever. Yeah, something like that. Okay, do you want to ask this last one from?
About cleanup?
Yes, please.
Susan says, cleanup and disposal of oil-based paint is classically a pain. How do you do that with linseed paint?
Well, first of all, you don't have to, because it never goes off. And what I would do certainly is with brush maintenance, just keep your brushes in some raw linseed oil, because the raw linseed oil never dries. So I've got, for each color group that we do, we've got different cans. So all the kind of brushes I've used for greens go into one can, and they just sit there, and they've been sat there for, in some cases, like years. Yeah. When you then start painting, just take the brush out, you wipe off the excess, you go straight into your paint can and you start painting, right? So there isn't any waste, because the paint never goes off. So you don't have to. But if you do want to get rid of those kind of dregs of paint that you might have sitting around in your garage or something, we're signed up to the paint recycle scheme all across the US. Well, I think it's 8 or 9 states now, I think, that are part of it. So we're part of this now because we want to encourage kind of just the reuse of those kind of bits and pieces. But it's not a petrochemical oil paint, right? This is, when people talk about oil paint, this isn't alkyd or anything. This is essentially vegetable oil. That's kind of how I think also the waste disposal should look at it, but they don't, because it's, well, not yet anyway.
Okay.
We'll get there.
And I wrote a blog article about spontaneous combustion and how to handle rags and things like that. So I'll just drop that in the show notes. The Perfect. Information is the same across the board. I have one final question for you, and then we want you to tell us where we can find your paints. But if you could drive home only one point, what would that point be? If
you think you've applied it thinly, think again.
Okay.
Apply it even thinner. It solves 90% of the issues.
This has been wonderful. Thank you. So if people want to find your paint, find out more about you, learn more, where can we send them?
Yeah, so well, the website is the obvious place to begin with. Linseedoilpaint.com. That's purely specified, completely for the US market. So people can, there's loads of videos and information, bits and pieces on there. We're going to launch a whole new Instagram campaign as well with how-tos and all that kind of stuff. So follow us on @Linseed For those based in the UK, it's linseedpaint.com, and we have a more international Instagram account, which is Linseed Paint.
Great.
Linseed Paint.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll put all those in the show notes. So, Michiel, it was wonderful to have you here. There's so much information. I think this is going to be really helpful, and we're glad you were able to come on the show and talk to us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to True Tales from Old Houses, and thank you to our guest, Michiel Brouns, and to our sponsors, The Window Course, Sutherland Wells, Repaint Studios, and Old House Hub. To continue the conversation, follow True Tales from Old Houses on Instagram or Facebook, and follow Daniel @Daniel Cantor and myself @Blake Hill House. Please do send us your questions and comments via the contact form or voicemail at truetalesfromoldhouses.com. And if you love what you heard today, hit that follow button wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a review. It helps other old house lovers find the show. We'll have a fresh new mini-sode for you next week. So until next time.